Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the forgotten backroads of America, places where light fades, and what remains are stories that refuse to die. Across these hills, rivers, and empty towns are accounts drawn from witness reports, police files, and archived broadcasts, each one verified, recorded, and retold in their own words. In the vast expanse of the Utah Navajo Reservation, where ancient traditions meet modern law enforcement, tribal police officers serve as guardians of both people and land. But sometimes, even these protectors encounter phenomena beyond explanation. Now, let us begin with our first story. The Utah Navajo Reservation spans nearly 2 million acres across San Juan County, a landscape of red mesas, deep canyons, and endless desert horizons. Here, the Navajo Nation Police Department maintains a small but dedicated force of officers who patrol roads that stretch for hundreds of miles between communities. These officers are often first responders to incidents that blur the line between the natural and supernatural, between the explainable and the profoundly mysterious. The following 7 cases represent some of the most disturbing encounters documented by tribal police over the past 3 decades, each verified through official reports, witness testimony, and corroborating evidence. What emerges from these accounts is a pattern of encounters that defy conventional explanation. Officers trained in law enforcement find themselves confronting phenomena that exist outside their training and experience. In a land where the veil between worlds is said to be thin, these police officers serve as reluctant witnesses to events that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Their stories remind us that even in our modern age, there remain mysteries that resist categorization, phenomena that continue to occur in the shadowed canyons and moonlit mesas of the American Southwest. It was late October of 2012. Officer Thomas Begay had been with the Navajo Nation Police Department for 6 years, assigned to the Aneth District in the southeastern corner of Utah. The reservation's remote communities required officers to work long shifts, often alone, covering vast territories with limited backup. That particular evening had been uneventful until dispatch received a call at 9:47 p.m. from a residence on the western edge of Aneth, reporting a domestic disturbance with unusual sounds. As Begay approached the address, his patrol car's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a modest, single-story home with a pickup truck parked outside. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary as he stepped out of his vehicle, the desert air cool against his skin. The night was unusually still, with no wind rustling the juniper trees that dotted the landscape. As Begay walked toward the front door, he noticed the house was completely dark, no lights visible through the windows. He knocked firmly, announced his presence, and received no response. After a second attempt with the same result, he tried the doorknob and found it unlocked. Drawing his flashlight, he entered the home, calling out to announce his presence. The interior was in disarray, furniture overturned, and a broken lamp lay on the floor. But what caught his attention immediately was the silence. No crying, no arguing, no sounds of movement at all. The home felt empty, yet the 911 call had come from this address less than 20 minutes earlier. Begay methodically cleared each room, his training taking over despite the unease creeping up his spine. In the master bedroom, he found evidence of a struggle, a knocked-over nightstand, scattered clothing, and a phone lying on the floor with a receiver off the hook. But the residents, a Navajo couple in their late 30s, were nowhere to be found. As he was examining the room, he heard a sound from the hallway, a soft shuffling, like bare feet on linoleum. He called out, identifying himself again, but received no response. When he stepped into the hallway, nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified. A sensation he had never experienced so strongly in all his years of law enforcement. The dispatcher's voice crackled over his radio, asking for a status update. As Begay reached for his shoulder mic, he noticed something peculiar in the corner of his eye, a shadow that moved independently of any object or person. It slid along the wall near the ceiling, elongated and darker than the surrounding darkness. When he turned his head directly toward it, it vanished. He reported the missing couple and the signs of struggle, requesting backup and a search team. As he spoke, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop suddenly, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. The shuffling sound came again, this time from the living room, followed by what he would later describe as a voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. When backup arrived 15 minutes later, they found Officer Begay standing outside the home, visibly shaken. A thorough search of the property revealed no signs of the couple, no footprints leading away from the house, and no indication of forced entry beyond the door Begay had entered. The case was logged as 12847B, a missing persons investigation that would remain active for years. What wasn't included in the official report were Begay's observations about the moving shadow and the inexplicable sounds. The couple, Maria and Daniel Yazzie, were never found. Their disappearance remains one of the most baffling cases in Navajo Nation Police history. 3 days after the incident, Begay returned to the abandoned home with a search team and medicine man. The traditional practitioner performed a blessing ceremony, explaining that certain entities were drawn to conflict and negative energy. During the ceremony, a window in the master bedroom shattered spontaneously, though no one was near it and no projectiles were found. The medicine man finished his work quickly, advising that the house should be avoided, especially at night. 6 months later, the home was demolished by tribal authorities, deemed unsafe for occupation. Officer Begay transferred to a different district the following year, though he never spoke publicly about what he experienced that October night. The silence of the Utah desert can be profound, but sometimes it is what fills that silence that truly disturbs the peace. It was early March of 2015. Officer Rebecca Wilson had been patrolling the remote roads near Monument Valley for nearly 8 hours without incident. The vast landscape of red sandstone buttes and mesas stretched endlessly around her, bathed in the pale light of a waning moon. Wilson, originally from Salt Lake City, had joined the Navajo Nation Police 3 years earlier, drawn by the challenge of serving in such isolated territory. Her patrol car, a standard-issue Ford Explorer with 4-wheel drive, was her only companion on this lonely stretch of Utah Highway 163. At approximately 2:13 a.m., as she approached the Arizona border, her vehicle began to sputter before the engine died completely, leaving her coasting to a stop on the empty highway. The desert night was cold, with temperatures hovering near freezing. Wilson attempted to restart her vehicle multiple times, but each attempt was met with only the clicking of the starter. She contacted dispatch to report her position and mechanical failure, learning that the nearest tow service wouldn't be available until morning. Resigned to a long wait, she settled in for what she expected would be an uneventful few hours until sunrise. That's when the radio disturbances began first, as faint whispers beneath the normal dispatch frequency. Then, as clear voices speaking in what she recognized as Navajo, though she couldn't understand the words being said. The voices seemed to come through her police radio despite it being tuned to the correct channel. Wilson switched to her handheld backup radio, but the voices continued, now mixed with what sounded like distant drumming. She scanned through the available frequencies, finding the same transmission on each one. The voices grew more distinct, repeating what sounded like a warning or instruction. At one point, she thought she heard her own name whispered among the Navajo words. A sudden gust of wind rocked the vehicle, and Wilson noticed movement outside her driver's side window, several dark figures standing motionless in the desert, visible only when they briefly blocked the starlight. When she reached for her spotlight, the figures vanished, though she was certain they had been there just moments before. The drumming sound grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. Wilson, trained to remain calm under pressure, felt her heart racing as she checked that all her doors were locked. The radio transmission changed again, now featuring what sounded like a child crying, followed by the same Navajo voices speaking in what seemed to be a response. Through her windshield, Wilson saw lights moving between the mesas, too low to be aircraft, too steady to be campfires. They moved in patterns that defied explanation, forming geometric shapes before disappearing behind the rock formations. The temperature inside the patrol car continued to drop despite the heater running at full blast. Wilson reached for her flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness outside her vehicle. The light revealed nothing but empty desert and the imposing silhouettes of the monuments that gave this region its name. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes observing her from the darkness beyond her limited field of vision. The Navajo voices on the radio grew more urgent, their cadence increasing as if conveying some critical message she couldn't comprehend. Wilson had picked up only a few phrases of the Diné language in her 3 years on the reservation, but none of what she heard sounded familiar, and these words were ancient, rhythmic, and unsettling in their intensity. The drumming sound shifted, becoming more complex, with multiple rhythms interweaving in patterns that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her bones. Wilson felt a strange vibration in her chest, as if the very air around her vehicle had thickened and was pulsing with some unseen energy. She tried her radio again, intending to contact dispatch about the bizarre transmissions, but found that the microphone was emitting the same Navajo voices, now speaking directly through the device in her hand. Startled, she dropped the radio on the passenger seat, where it continued to broadcast the mysterious message. Through the windshield, Wilson noticed that the lights between the mesas had changed their formation. Where before they had moved in geometric patterns, they now arranged themselves in a line that stretched from one horizon to the other, pulsing in sequence as if communicating across vast distances. The child's crying on the radio had ceased, replaced by what sounded like chanting multiple voices now speaking in unison, their tones shifting from urgent to soothing and back again. Wilson found herself mesmerized by the sounds, despite not understanding their meaning. She felt an inexplicable urge to exit her vehicle, to walk toward the mesas where the lights danced in the darkness. The cold inside the patrol car intensified, frost forming on the inside of the windows, despite the heater still running at full blast. Wilson could see her breath in the beam of her flashlight, which had begun to flicker erratically. The vehicle's electrical system was clearly compromised, though she couldn't determine whether it was related to the initial engine failure or part of whatever phenomenon was unfolding around her. She checked her service weapon, ensuring it was accessible if needed, though she couldn't identify what threat it might protect her from. The figures she had seen earlier remained absent, yet their presence lingered in her memory, tall, silent shapes that had moved with an unnatural stillness. As the night wore on, Wilson found herself growing increasingly exhausted despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her eyelids felt heavy, her thoughts becoming fragmented. She realized with a start that she was losing time. Moments seemed to skip, like a film with missing frames. 1 minute she would be scanning the desert landscape. The next, she would find herself staring at her hands, unsure of how they had gotten there. The Navajo voices on the radio seemed to notice her state, their tones changing to what almost sounded like concern, though she knew she was projecting her own emotions onto the incomprehensible words. The lights between the mesas began to dim one by one, until only a single orb remained, hovering near the westernmost formation. The drumming and chanting on the radio softened to a whisper, then fell silent altogether. For the first time in what seemed like hours, Wilson heard only the normal static of the unused frequencies. She reached for the ignition, turning the key more out of habit than expectation. To her astonishment, the engine roared to life immediately, its purr a welcome contrast to the unnatural sounds that had filled the night. The heater began to work properly again, slowly warming the frigid interior of the vehicle. At approximately 3:47 a.m., Wilson's patrol car engine suddenly roared back to life without her turning the key. The radio transmissions ceased instantly, replaced by the normal static of the unused frequencies. The mysterious lights in the distance had vanished. Wilson wasted no time putting the vehicle in drive and accelerating away from the area, not stopping until she reached the small town of Mexican Hat, some 20 miles away. There, she met with responding officers who found her visibly shaken, but otherwise unharmed. A subsequent inspection of her patrol vehicle revealed no mechanical issues that would explain the sudden failure and restoration of power. The official incident report, filed as 15203A, noted the mechanical failure and unusual radio transmissions, but omitted Wilson's observations of the figures and lights. In private conversations with fellow officers, she described the experience as the most profoundly disturbing event of my life. Wilson never again worked the night shift alone, requesting transfer to a desk position 6 months later. Other officers who patrolled the same stretch of highway reported similar, though less dramatic incidents over the following years: unexplained radio transmissions, vehicle malfunctions, and sightings of anomalous lights. The Navajo elders who were consulted about the incident spoke of the area being a place where the veil between worlds grows thin, especially during the early morning hours. Some things, they suggested, are not meant to be understood by those who walk the physical world. It was mid-November of 2008. Officer Joseph Chi was conducting a routine patrol of the remote area surrounding Kayenta, Arizona, near the Utah border. A veteran of the Navajo Nation Police with 15 years of service, Chi knew these desert roads like the back of his hand. The morning was crisp and clear, with the first light of dawn casting long shadows across the red earth. At approximately 7:22 a.m., while checking on a remote water pumping station, Chi noticed something unusual in the sand footprints that didn't match any footwear he recognized. They were long and narrow, with what appeared to be 3 toes, each ending in a sharp point. The tracks circled the pumping station twice before heading east toward the mesas. Chi photographed the prints and radio dispatch to report his findings before following the trail of footprints. The tracks extended for nearly half a mile across the desert floor, moving with a strange, loping gait that covered ground at an unnatural pace. What disturbed Chi most was the depth of the prints. They were pressed deep into the hard-packed sand, suggesting tremendous weight. As he followed the trail, he noticed that the prints occasionally disappeared for 50 to 100 yards before reappearing ahead, as if whatever made them had briefly taken to the air. The wind began to pick up, whispering across the desert as Chi continued his pursuit, his curiosity overcoming his initial unease. The trail led to the base of a towering sandstone formation known locally as the Sleeping Eagle. There, the footprints simply ended, with no indication of where the creature had gone. Chi circled the formation twice, finding no other tracks, no cave entrance, no evidence of any kind that would explain the disappearance. As he was examining the area where the prints terminated, he heard a sound from above, a scraping noise, like something moving across the rock face. He looked up but saw nothing against the red stone. The sound continued for several minutes before ceasing abruptly, followed by a cascade of small pebbles that rained down near where Chi stood. Chi took a step back from the formation, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. He scanned the cliff face above, his eyes adjusting to the morning light that now illuminated the sandstone. Nothing moved, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. The air around him seemed to grow still, the normal desert sounds of birds and insects falling silent. Chi, a traditional Navajo who had been raised with stories of the Yi-Naldlushi skinwalkers who could take the form of animals, found himself questioning what he had been taught was merely folklore. These prints were unlike any animal track he had encountered in his 15 years of patrolling this land. He radioed dispatch again, requesting that 2 additional officers meet him at the location with casting materials for the prints. As he waited, Chi continued his examination of the area, noting details that had initially escaped his attention. The sand around the termination point of the tracks showed signs of disturbance, as if something had been dragged or lifted from the spot. Small particles of what appeared to be blackened sand were scattered in a circular pattern, though they were barely visible against the red earth. When Chi bent to examine them more closely, he noticed they were strangely cool to the touch, despite the warming morning sun. The wind shifted, bringing with it a faint odor that Chi couldn't identify, something like ozone after a thunderstorm mixed with the scent of burning sage. He had encountered this smell once before, years earlier during a search for a missing hiker in the same general area. That case had ended with the hiker found alive but disoriented, claiming to have been guided through the desert by tall shadows that moved without making sound. At the time, Chi had attributed the man's story to dehydration and heat exposure. But now he wondered if there might be a connection. Officers Daniel Yazzie and Ella Benally arrived approximately 40 minutes after Chi's call, bringing with them plaster casting materials and an evidence kit. Both were experienced officers familiar with the desert terrain, yet neither could explain the tracks they found at the base of the Sleeping Eagle. Yazzie, who had grown up in the area, immediately recognized the formation as a place his grandmother had warned him to avoid as a child. She called it the place where the world wears thin, he explained to Chi as they examined the prints. She said that sometimes things from the other side come through, especially during certain seasons. Benally, who had studied wildlife biology before joining the police department, was equally baffled by the tracks. The stride length is impossible, she noted, measuring the distance between prints. Whatever made these would need to be at least 8 feet tall to cover this ground with each step. And the depth suggests a weight of several hundred pounds. Yet the prints are narrow and don't show the kind of compression you'd expect from something that heavy. She pointed out how the 3-toed impressions showed no signs of claws or pads, unlike any animal native to the region. As the officers worked to create plaster casts of several of the best-preserved prints, Chi noticed something else: unusual small stones arranged in patterns around the termination point of the tracks. They formed a spiral that wound inward toward where the footprints ended, each stone placed with deliberate precision. When Chi mentioned this to his colleagues, Yazzie became visibly uneasy, explaining that such patterns were sometimes associated with ceremonies meant to open doorways between worlds. My grandfather told me stories about medicine men who could walk through the rock, he said quietly. He said they left markers like this to show others the way. The casting process took nearly 2 hours, during which time the officers remained vigilant, scanning their surroundings for any sign of what might have made the tracks. The desert had returned to its normal state. Birds sang, insects buzzed, a light breeze rustled the sparse vegetation, yet the atmosphere remained charged with an unspoken tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. When they finally removed the plaster casts from the sand, the detail was remarkable. Each toe ended in what appeared to be a sharp point, almost like a claw, and the pressure distribution suggested a weight that was somehow concentrated in a small area. Later that day, Chi returned with 2 other officers and a tribal wildlife expert. None could identify the tracks, which were unlike any human or animal prints they had encountered before. The wildlife expert noted that the stride length, nearly 6 feet, was beyond the capability of any known creature in the region. The officers made plaster casts of several of the best-preserved prints and logged the incident as originate 612C, an unidentified animal sighting. What wasn't included in the official report was Chi's certainty that whatever made the tracks had been watching him from the mesa above, and that it had intentionally allowed him to follow its trail to that specific location. In the weeks that followed, other officers reported similar footprints in various locations across the Utah portion of the reservation. Each time, the tracks would lead to some significant geological formation before simply ending. Local medicine men spoke of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches of Navajo legend, though they were reluctant to discuss the topic in detail. Chi, a traditional Navajo who had been raised with these stories, found himself increasingly troubled by the encounter. He began carrying corn pollen and a small medicine bundle on his patrols, precautions his grandfather had taught him years ago. The plaster casts of the footprints were sent to a university lab for analysis, but the results were inconclusive, suggesting only that the prints had been made by something with a weight distribution unlike any known species. Sometimes the most disturbing encounters are not what we see but what we cannot explain. It was late April of 2017. Search and Rescue Coordinator Michael Tiso received an urgent call at 4:18 a.m. about a missing child near the Utah-Arizona border. 5-year-old Lucy Benally had wandered away from her family's home sometime during the night, and her parents discovered her absence when they awoke. So immediately assembled a search team consisting of 3 Navajo Nation police officers, 2 volunteers from the community, and a tracking dog from a neighboring county. By dawn, they were conducting a systematic search of the rugged terrain surrounding the Benally residence. The area was challenging, with deep canyons, thick brush, and numerous hiding places where a small child could easily become lost or injured. The first day of searching yielded no signs of the missing girl. As night fell, the search team expanded to include additional officers and volunteers. So established a command post at a nearby ranger station where he coordinated search efforts and maintained contact with Lucy's distraught parents. At approximately 9:37 p.m., one of the search teams reported finding Lucy's favorite blanket near the edge of a steep canyon. The discovery provided hope that they were on the right track, though it also raised concerns that the child might have fallen into the canyon. So immediately dispatched additional teams to search the canyon floor, while others continued to comb the surrounding area. The night was cold and clear, with a full moon illuminating the landscape in silver light. At 11:52 p.m., Officer Sarah Lee radioed in with a strange report. She and her partner had found small footprints that appeared to belong to a child, but they led to the edge of the canyon and then continued on the other side, as if the child had simply walked across the void. When Tesso asked for clarification, Lee explained that there was no bridge, no fallen tree, no way to cross the canyon at that point. Yet the footprints were clearly visible on both sides, perfectly aligned as if the ground between them didn't exist. So instructed the officers to photograph the tracks and continue searching, though he privately wondered if fatigue might be playing tricks on their eyes. An hour later, another team reported hearing a child's laughter coming from deep within the canyon. Though when they called Lucy's name, the sound immediately ceased. The search continued through the night, with growing concern for Lucy's safety. At 3:18 a.m., Officer Lee and her partner made another disturbing discovery: Lucy's small shoe, sitting atop a tall rock formation that appeared impossible to climb without equipment. The shoe was clean and undamaged, placed carefully as if by hand. As they were photographing the finding, both officers reported seeing a small figure standing at the edge of the canyon, some distance away. When they called out, the figure vanished into the shadows. By dawn, the search had expanded to include helicopters and additional ground teams, but there was still no sign of the missing child. So, a methodical investigator with 20 years of experience in search and rescue operations found himself increasingly troubled by the anomalous evidence. The footprints that crossed the canyon defied all logic. The distance between the two sides was nearly 50 feet, with sheer drops on both sides. Yet the tracks continued uninterrupted, with the same depth and spacing on both sides. He dispatched a team to rappel into the canyon, searching for any explanation, a hidden ledge, an unusual rock formation, anything that might account for the impossible tracks. They found nothing but the normal canyon floor, with no indication that anyone had passed that way recently. As morning broke, Tso called a brief meeting at the command post to review the strange findings. Officer Lee, normally composed and professional, seemed visibly shaken as she described seeing the small figure at the canyon's edge. It was like a shadow that had substance, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. It looked like Lucy, but somehow wrong, taller than she should be. And when it moved, it didn't quite move like a person. Her partner, Officer Tom Wilson, corroborated her account, adding that the figure had seemed to dissolve rather than run away when they called out. The shoe on the rock formation presented another puzzle. The spire of rock rose nearly 30 feet from the canyon floor, with no visible handholds or footholds. Yet Lucy's small pink sneaker sat perfectly balanced on its peak, as if placed there by someone with the ability to float or fly. A helicopter was dispatched to retrieve the shoe, which was photographed extensively before being carefully bagged as evidence. When examined, the shoe showed no signs of unusual wear or damage, and the sole contained only the normal dirt and debris one would expect from a child's footwear. Nothing that would explain how it came to be atop the inaccessible rock formation. As the day wore on, search teams expanded their operation to cover a wider area, following protocol for missing child cases despite the unusual circumstances. Tso found himself torn between the standard procedures he knew so well and the growing sense that this case was anything but standard. He consulted with the tribal elders who had gathered at the command post, offering prayers and traditional wisdom. One elder, a woman in her 80s named Grandma Tsosi, spoke of the little people, who were said to inhabit the canyonlands, beings who could sometimes take human children, not to harm them, but to play with them before returning them to their world. The stories say they're curious about our children, Grandma Tsosi explained, her voice raspy with age. They don't understand why our children grow up while theirs stay small forever. Sometimes they borrow a child for a night to learn from them, then return them where they found them. She advised the searchers to look for signs of small stone arrangements, which she said the little people used as markers or doorways. So, though skeptical, instructed his teams to keep an eye out for such formations, not wanting to dismiss any possibility in the search for Lucy. The break came at 7:42 a.m., when a rancher checking his livestock found Lucy Benally walking along a dirt road nearly 5 miles from her home. The child was unharmed, though her clothing was slightly damp with morning dew. When questioned about where she had been, Lucy gave a confused account that made little sense. She spoke of walking with the Star People through a door in the rock and visiting a place where the ground wasn't real. She mentioned playing with the Shadow Man, who showed her how to walk on air. The child's feet were bare and showed no signs of injury despite having apparently walked through rough terrain during the night. The official search report logged the incident as 17411A. A successful missing child case with no further explanation for the anomalous evidence discovered during the search. In the weeks that followed, Lucy's parents noticed changes in their daughter. She would sometimes stare at empty spaces and laugh, or point to the sky and speak of her star friends. A child psychologist who evaluated Lucy suggested she had constructed an elaborate fantasy to cope with being lost, though her parents weren't convinced. Officer Sarah Lee, one of the first to find the impossible footprints, transferred to a different district 3 months later. In her exit interview, she mentioned only that some things in this desert don't follow the rules we're used to. The San Juan County Sheriff's Department still has the photographs of Lucy's shoe on the rock and the footprints that crossed the canyon, filed away as unexplained anomalies in an otherwise closed case. Sometimes the most disturbing stories are those that end with the victims safe, yet leave behind questions that haunt those who searched for them. It was early September of 2014. Officer Samuel Yazzie was patrolling the remote area near Hovenweep National Monument along the Utah-Colorado border. The night was warm and clear, with countless stars visible in the dark desert sky. Yazzie, a relatively new addition to the Navajo Nation Police, was still adjusting to the isolation of night patrol in this sparsely populated region. At approximately 10:47 p.m., he received a call from dispatch about reports of strange lights in the sky near the monument. Multiple residents had phoned in, describing unusual aerial phenomena that didn't match aircraft or satellite behavior. Yazzie was the closest officer, approximately 15 miles from the location, and was instructed to investigate. As Yazzie approached the area, he could see the lights himself, 3 bright orbs moving in a triangular formation, hovering silently above the ancient ruins. They emitted a steady white light that seemed to pulse slowly, growing brighter and then dimming in a rhythmic pattern. Yazzie pulled his patrol car to a stop at a viewpoint overlooking the monument, grabbing his binoculars for a better look. Through the lenses, he could see that the lights were not attached to any visible craft or structure. They simply hung in the night sky, defying explanation. He radioed dispatch to confirm the sighting, noting that the lights were unlike any aircraft he had encountered before. As he watched, one of the lights separated from the others and began moving slowly toward his position. The approaching light maintained a steady altitude of approximately 200 feet, moving without sound across the desert landscape. Yazzie felt a mixture of professional curiosity and personal unease as the light drew closer, its brilliance illuminating the area around his patrol car. He reached for his dashboard camera to document the phenomenon, but the device refused to turn on, despite functioning normally earlier in his shift. The light continued its approach until it was hovering directly above his vehicle, bathing the surrounding desert in an otherworldly glow. Yazzie reported his situation to dispatch, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. That's when his radio cut out, replaced by a series of tones and what sounded like voices speaking in a language he couldn't identify. Yazzie sat in the sudden silence of his vehicle, the light outside pulsing with increased intensity. He noticed that the interior of his patrol car was growing colder, his breath visible in the air despite the warm night outside. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, and his vehicle's engine began to sputter before dying completely. Through his windshield, Yazzie watched as figures began to descend from the light, tall, slender silhouettes that moved with an unnatural grace. They touched down in the desert some 50 yards from his position and began moving slowly toward his vehicle. Yazzie reached for his sidearm, then thought better of it, remembering his training to observe and report rather than engage with unknown phenomena. The figures stopped approximately 30 yards from his patrol car, standing motionless in the desert. Yazzie estimated they were at least 7 feet tall, with proportions that were nearly human, but subtly wrong. The light above began to dim slowly, and the figures seemed to fade along with it, becoming transparent before disappearing entirely. Within minutes, the light had vanished completely, leaving only the normal starlight above. Yazi's patrol car engine suddenly roared back to life, and his radio came back online with dispatch calling his name, concerned about the sudden loss of contact. He reported that the lights had disappeared, but omitted the details about the figures that had emerged from them, knowing how it would sound in his official report. In the days following the encounter, Yazi found himself struggling to process what he had experienced. As a man of science and reason, he had always been skeptical of stories about strange phenomena in the desert. Yet what he had witnessed defied all logical explanation. The light had moved with purpose and intelligence, and the figures that emerged from it were unlike anything he had encountered in his 28 years. He began researching similar sightings in the area, discovering that Hovenweep had a long history of unusual light phenomena dating back centuries. The ancestral Puebloans, who had built the stone towers in the area, had apparently recorded strange lights in the sky in their petroglyphs and oral histories. Yazi returned to the site of his encounters several times in the following weeks, hoping to find some physical evidence that might explain what had happened. The desert floor showed no signs of disturbance, no footprints, no burn marks, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Yet when he took photographs of the area, they often developed with strange light anomalies or orbs that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. On one occasion, his electromagnetic field detector, which he had brought as an afterthought, registered unusually high readings in the exact spot where the figures had stood before disappearing. The incident began to affect Yazi's personal life as well. He experienced vivid dreams of the tall figures and the pulsing light, sometimes waking with the feeling that he had been somewhere else during the night. His wife noticed changes in his behavior. He had become more withdrawn, sometimes staring into space for long periods. When she pressed him about what was wrong, he found himself unable to explain, knowing how it would sound. How could he describe the profound sense of awe mixed with terror he had felt when the figures approached his vehicle? How could he explain the feeling that they had been examining him, studying him like a specimen under a microscope? Other officers who patrolled the same area reported similar, though less dramatic, incidents over the following months. Some mentioned equipment malfunctions, radios cutting out, vehicles stalling for no apparent reason. Others spoke of seeing unusual lights that moved in patterns that defied explanation. Most kept these observations to themselves, knowing how they would be received by their superiors. Yet a quiet understanding developed among those who had experienced something unusual in the desert night, a shared knowledge that some things existed beyond the realm of normal explanation. The incident was logged as 14927B, unidentified aerial phenomena, with Yazi's written report focusing on the lights rather than what followed. In the days after the encounter, Yazi experienced headaches and periods of missing time, though he kept these symptoms to himself. Other officers who responded to similar reports in the same area over the following months noted equipment malfunctions and radio interference, though none reported seeing figures. The Hovenweep lights have continued to appear sporadically over the years, always with similar characteristics: silent movement, unusual patterns, and occasional electronic interference. Yazi never again worked night patrol in that district, requesting a transfer to a more populated area. Some encounters leave no physical evidence, only memories that continue to unsettle those who experience them, long after the lights have faded from the sky. It was late June of 2010. Officer David Keene was working the night shift in Bluff, Utah, a small community near the San Juan River. Keene had been with the Navajo Nation Police for just over a year, still relatively new to the area and its many mysteries. The night was unseasonably cool, with a gentle breeze blowing through the town as Keene made his rounds. At approximately 1:23 a.m., dispatch notified him that a hiker had discovered a police uniform and equipment near the base of the sandstone cliffs north of town. The items belonged to Officer Mark Tso, who had been missing for 3 weeks after failing to return from a patrol of the remote area. Keene was instructed to secure the scene and await a search team to conduct a more thorough investigation at first light. Keene arrived at the location approximately 20 minutes later, finding the uniform neatly folded on a flat rock with Tso's service weapon, radio, and other equipment arranged beside it. What caught Keene's attention immediately was a small digital voice recorder lying next to the equipment, a personal device not issued by the department. As he was securing the area, Keene noticed something glinting in the beam of his flashlight near the uniform. Upon closer inspection, he discovered it was Tso's badge, partially buried in the sand. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints beyond his own, and no indication of what had happened to the missing officer. The scene was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the wind whispering through the canyon. The sandstone cliffs rose majestically against the night sky, their red surfaces appearing almost black in the dim light. Keene had patrolled this area many times since joining the force, yet tonight it felt different, more ancient, more alive with unseen presence. The moon, just past full, cast long shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. As a former officer from a suburban department in Arizona, Keene was still adjusting to the vastness of the Navajo Nation, where the landscape itself seemed to hold memories and secrets that stretched back thousands of years. He thought of Officer Tso, a respected veteran who had served the community for over 15 years. Known for his knowledge of both modern law enforcement and traditional Navajo ways. Against protocol, Keene made a decision to listen to the recording before the search team arrived. He told himself it might contain clues about Tso's whereabouts, though he knew the real reason was curiosity mixed with a growing sense of unease. The first few minutes of the recording contained only ambient sounds, wind, Tso's breathing, the crunch of boots on sand. Then came Tso's voice, calm and professional as he reported his position and noted that he was investigating some unusual lights near the canyon wall. The recording continued with Tso's observations about the lights, how they moved in patterns that defied explanation, how they seemed to respond to his presence by growing brighter or dimming. Keene sat in his patrol car, the recorder pressed to his ear, the darkness of the desert pressing in around him. The recording quality was surprisingly clear, capturing not just Tso's voice, but the subtle sounds of the night-distant coyotes, the rustle of some small creature in the brush, the whisper of wind through rock formations. Tso's voice on the recording sounded relaxed, almost conversational, as if he were speaking to himself rather than making an official report. He described the lights as pale blue orbs that move like water flowing uphill, defying gravity but not the laws of their own mysterious physics. Keene found himself holding his breath, captivated by Tso's detailed observations and the poetic quality of his descriptions. Approximately 15 minutes into the recording, Tso's breathing became more rapid. He described seeing figures moving along the canyon wall, like shadows but with substance. The sound of his footsteps quickened as he apparently moved closer to investigate. That's when the strange noises began, what sounded like chanting in a language Keene didn't recognize, mixed with a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the recording itself. Tso's voice returned, now with an edge of fear, as he reported that his radio wasn't working and his vehicle wouldn't start. The recording captured his attempts to call for help, his voice growing increasingly desperate as the chanting and humming grew louder. Keene felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to the chanting on the recording. It was unlike any music he had heard before, rhythmic yet discordant, with multiple voices overlapping in patterns that seemed to shift and change like the desert sands. The humming beneath it was even more unsettling, a low frequency that seemed to resonate in his own chest despite coming through the small speaker of the recorder. Tso's breathing became more labored, and Keen could hear the sound of running, of boots scrambling on loose rock. Then came Tso's voice again, now speaking in Navajo rapid, urgent words that Keen couldn't understand but could feel the emotion behind. The recording captured the metallic click of Tso drawing his service weapon, followed by several moments of silence, broken only by the strange chanting and the sound of wind. The final minutes of the recording were disturbing in their ambiguity. Tso's breathing became ragged, and he could be heard whispering what sounded like prayers in Navajo. The chanting and humming reached a crescendo, punctuated by what sounded like rocks falling from the cliff above. Then came Tso's final words. "They're not from the rocks, they're in the rocks," followed by a sudden silence that lasted nearly a minute before the recording ended. Keen sat in his patrol car, the recorder in his hand, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He copied the recording to his personal phone before securing it with the other evidence, knowing it would likely disappear into an evidence locker, never to be heard again. The desert night seemed to grow colder as Keen processed what he had heard. Tso's final words echoed in his mind. "They're not from the rocks, they're in the rocks." A statement that defied logic yet resonated with some deep, primal part of his understanding. Keen thought of the Navajo stories he had heard since arriving in the area. Tales of the Anasazi, who had inhabited these canyons centuries ago, and of the beings said to inhabit the same spaces today. He remembered an elder telling him that some places in the desert were thin, where the veil between worlds was easily pierced. Looking at the towering cliffs above him, Keen felt for the first time that he was standing in just such a place. The search team arrived at dawn, conducting a thorough investigation of the area. They found no signs of Officer Tso, no additional tracks, and no explanation for what had happened to him. The official report logged the discovery of Tso's equipment and the voice recording as evidence in the ongoing missing person case 10615D. What wasn't included in the report was Keen's unauthorized listening of the recording or its disturbing contents. Tso was never found, and the case eventually went cold, though his name remained on the department's missing persons list. Keen never spoke of what he heard on that recording, though the sounds continued to haunt his dreams. In the weeks that followed, Keen found himself increasingly preoccupied with the recording and its implications. He listened to it repeatedly in private, trying to make sense of the chanting and the strange humming. He consulted with a Navajo linguist who identified the language as an archaic form of Diné that few could understand today. The linguist translated fragments of Tso's Navajo speech, which included references to the stone people and the ancient ones who dwell in darkness. These references troubled Keen, as they seemed to align with certain traditional stories about beings that inhabited the canyonlands long before the arrival of the Navajo people. Keen began researching the history of the area where Tso had disappeared, discovering that the sandstone cliffs contained numerous caves and alcoves that had been used by the Anasazi for ceremonial purposes. Some of these sites were considered sacred or dangerous by the local Navajo, who avoided them especially at certain times of the year. Keen learned that Tso had been investigating reports of unusual lights in the area for several weeks before his disappearance, keeping unofficial notes that suggested he believed there might be a connection between these phenomena and the ancient petroglyphs that dotted the canyon walls. These notes, which Keen discovered in Tso's desk after his disappearance, hinted at a theory that Tso was developing about interdimensional doorways or portals located in specific geological formations. The department's investigation into Tso's disappearance was thorough but ultimately fruitless. Search teams combed the area for weeks, using helicopters, ground teams, and even climbers to explore the cliff faces where Tso had last been seen. They found no trace of him, no body, no additional equipment, no sign of struggle or violence. The official conclusion was that Tso had likely fallen into one of the many deep canyons in the area. His body perhaps carried away by flash floods or covered by rock slides. But Keene knew this explanation didn't account for the neatly folded uniform, the arranged equipment, or the disturbing recording he had listened to that night. 3 months after Tso's disappearance, Keene requested a transfer to a different district, citing personal reasons. His request was approved, and he spent the next 2 years patrolling the more populated areas of the reservation. Though he never quite shook the feeling that something from that night had followed him. He experienced vivid nightmares in which he heard the chanting from the recording, sometimes waking to find his bedroom filled with a pale blue light, similar to what Tso had described. He began carrying a small medicine bundle given to him by a Navajo elder, who told him it would offer protection from unseen forces that wander the night. Keene never spoke of what he heard on that recording, though the sounds continued to haunt his dreams. Sometimes, when he was alone on patrol in the desert night, he thought he could hear faint chanting carried on the wind, or see blue lights dancing at the edge of his vision. He knew these could be tricks of the mind, manifestations of his own subconscious processing a traumatic experience. Yet part of him wondered if Tso had stumbled upon something real that night, something ancient and powerful that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human understanding. The recording, which Keene had secretly copied before turning it over as evidence, remained in his possession, a digital artifact of an encounter that defied explanation. 5 years after Tso's disappearance, Keene left the Navajo Nation Police, moving back to Arizona to work as a private investigator. The official missing person case for Mark Tso remained open but inactive, filed away with other unsolved mysteries of the desert. Keene occasionally checked on the case, but no new information ever emerged. Tso's family held a traditional ceremony after 4 years had passed, honoring his memory and accepting that he would likely never return. They spoke of him walking on into the next world, becoming part of the landscape he had loved and served so faithfully. Sometimes the most disturbing evidence isn't what we can see and touch, but what we can only hear, voices from the darkness that remind us how little we truly understand about the world around us. The recording of Mark Tso's final moments remains one of the most perplexing pieces of evidence in the history of the Navajo Nation Police, a digital ghost story that continues to unsettle those who have heard it. Keene sometimes thinks of Tso's final words, "They're not from the rocks, they're in the rocks," and wonders what truth they might contain. In the vast, ancient landscape of the desert, where time seems to flow differently and the veil between worlds grows thin, some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved, their answers perhaps not meant for human understanding. It was early December of 2019. Officer Maria Martinez was conducting a welfare check at an abandoned hogan near Alhambra, Utah. The traditional Navajo dwelling had been reported as a potential shelter for homeless individuals during the approaching winter storms. Martinez, originally from New Mexico, had joined the Navajo Nation Police 2 years earlier and was still learning about the cultural significance of various locations on the reservation. The afternoon was cold and overcast, with low gray clouds obscuring the surrounding mesas. As Martinez approached the hogan, she noticed that despite its abandoned appearance, smoke was rising from the smoke hole in the center of the roof. The hogan's door faced east, as traditional, and was slightly ajar. Martinez called out, announcing her presence, but received no response. She pushed the door open and entered, her hand resting near her sidearm as a precaution. The interior was warmer than expected, with a small fire burning in the central fire pit. The space was empty of personal belongings, though there were signs of recent occupation, a blanket folded neatly in one corner, an empty coffee mug on the floor beside the fire pit. What caught Martinez's attention immediately were the markings on the wall, symbols and drawings that appeared to have been made recently, the charcoal still smudging slightly when she touched it. As Martinez was examining the symbols, she heard a sound from behind her, the soft clearing of a throat. She turned quickly to find an elderly Navajo man sitting cross-legged near the fire pit, though she was certain the space had been empty when she entered. The man appeared to be in his 70s or 80s, with weathered features and long silver hair, tied in a traditional bun. He wore modern clothing, a denim jacket and jeans, but his presence seemed to belong to another time. Martinez introduced herself and explained her purpose, noting that the Hogan was on tribal land and couldn't be occupied without permission. The man nodded slowly, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. The elderly man spoke in perfect English, explaining that he was only staying temporarily until the storm passed. He introduced himself as Hostin Tso, though when Martinez later checked tribal records, no one by that name could be found in the Alhambra area. As they spoke, Martinez noticed that the fire in the pit burned without any visible fuel, producing no smoke yet giving off significant heat. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them, their patterns changing in ways that defied explanation. Tso spoke of the old ways, of the beings that inhabit the desert, of the doors between worlds that sometimes open in sacred places like this Hogan. Martinez felt a growing sense of unease, though she couldn't identify any specific threat. The man's presence seemed to bend the light around him, creating subtle distortions in her vision. When she checked her watch, she was shocked to find that nearly 2 hours had passed since she entered the Hogan, though it felt like only 20 minutes. Tso smiled when she mentioned this, saying simply that time moves differently here. As Martinez prepared to leave, advising Tso that he would need to find other shelter, he offered her a warning. Some doors, he said, should never be opened, and some places remember those who visit them, holding echoes of their presence long after they've gone. The following day, Martinez returned to the Hogan with 2 other officers, intending to follow up on the welfare check. The Hogan was exactly as it had appeared before her visit abandoned, with dust covering the floor and no signs of recent occupation. The fire pit was cold and filled with debris, and there was no evidence that a fire had burned there recently. The symbols she had seen on the walls were gone, with only faint traces of charcoal remaining. The other officers found her story amusing, suggesting she had probably encountered one of the many elders who sometimes stay in traditional dwellings during spiritual journeys. Martinez knew differently what she had experienced in that Hogan defied rational explanation. The incident was logged as 19-12-2A, a routine welfare check with no further action required. Martinez never mentioned the temporal distortion or the impossible fire in her official report. In the weeks that followed, she experienced vivid dreams of the Hogan and the elderly man, sometimes waking with the smell of smoke in her nostrils, though her apartment contained no fireplace. She requested a transfer to a different district 3 months later, citing personal reasons. Other officers who conducted welfare checks at the same Hogan reported nothing unusual, though one mentioned feeling watched during his visit. The Alhambra Hogan still stands today, a reminder that some places hold memories and mysteries that transcend our understanding of time and space. It was late January of 2021. Officer Benjamin Joe was finishing his shift near the Utah-Arizona border when he received a call about a disturbance at a remote residence. The caller, an elderly woman, reported that someone had been knocking on her door and windows throughout the night, though no one was ever visible when she looked outside. Joe, a veteran officer with 20 years of service, was familiar with the caller, Mrs. Nez, a widow who lived alone in the isolated house. He had responded to similar calls from her over the past year, each time finding no evidence of intruders or any explanation for what she was hearing. This time, however, something felt different as he approached the small house, its windows dark against the pre-dawn sky. The air was frigid, with snow covering the ground and more falling gently in the beam of Joe's headlights. As he stepped out of his vehicle, he noticed footprints in the snow leading to Mrs. Nez's door, tracks that seemed to sink deep into the snow without spreading, as if made by something with tremendous weight on a very small surface area. Joe followed the tracks around the house, finding that they approached each window before moving to the next, with no indication of where they had come from or where they went afterward. Mrs. Nez met him at the door, her face pale with fear, insisting that someone had been knocking just moments before his arrival, though Joe had seen no one during his approach. Inside the house, Joe conducted a thorough search, while Mrs. Nez made tea and explained what had been happening over the past several nights. The knocking would begin around midnight, moving methodically from window to window around the house. When she approached a window to look out, the knocking would cease, only to begin at the next window. Sometimes she heard whispering, though she could never make out the words. What disturbed her most was that her dogs, normally protective and quick to bark at strangers, would hide trembling under her bed during these visits, refusing to come out until morning. Joe noted that the house was secure, with no signs of forced entry or damage to the windows or doors. As Joe was preparing to leave, promising to increase patrols in the area, they both heard it, a sharp rapping on the living room window, distinct and unmistakable. Joe drew his weapon and moved quickly to the window, but saw only darkness and falling snow outside. The tracks he had followed earlier showed no sign of fresh disturbance, yet the knocking had been clear and close. That's when Mrs. Nez's television, which had been turned off, suddenly flickered to life, displaying only static before showing a dark figure standing outside the very window Joe was watching. The figure appeared impossibly tall and thin, with proportions that were nearly human, but subtly wrong. As Joe watched, transfixed, the figure raised what appeared to be a hand and knocked again on the window. Though this time there was no sound, only the visual of the movement. The figure on the screen vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and the television returned to static before shutting off completely. Joe called for backup, his voice steady despite the cold dread creeping up his spine. When additional officers arrived 10 minutes later, they found no tracks beyond Joe's own, no disturbance to the snow around the house, and no explanation for what had occurred. Mrs. Nez was visibly shaken, but otherwise unharmed. The officers conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area, finding nothing that would explain the phenomenon. One of the responding officers noted that his body camera had malfunctioned during the incident, though it had been working properly earlier in his shift. The incident was logged as 21-113-15B, though the official report made only vague reference to unexplained disturbances. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Nez reported no further visits from her nighttime caller, though she refused to stay in the house alone, eventually moving to live with her daughter in Page, Arizona. Officer Joe never spoke publicly about what he saw on that television screen, though the image continued to haunt him. Other officers who patrolled the area reported occasional equipment malfunctions and strange sounds, though none experienced anything as dramatic as what Joe and Mrs. Nez encountered that January morning. The house stood empty for nearly a year before being purchased by new owners who reported nothing unusual. Some mysteries resolved themselves, leaving only memories and questions that continue to disturb those who experience them. The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, especially across the Navajo Nation, where ancient traditions meet modern law enforcement. The 7 cases we've explored tonight represent only a fraction of the unexplained encounters documented by tribal police over the decades. Each account, verified through official reports and witness testimony, reminds us that even in our modern age of technology and science, there remain phenomena that defy explanation. The Utah desert, with its mesas and canyons, holds secrets that continue to challenge our understanding of reality itself. What connects these disparate incidents is not just their location, but their effect on those who experience them. Officers trained in observation and documentation, who found themselves confronting events beyond their training and comprehension. These are not tales told for entertainment, but recorded encounters that continue to disturb the peace of mind of those who lived through them. In a land where the veil between worlds is said to be thin, where ancient stories speak of beings that walk between realms, the modern law enforcement officer sometimes becomes an unwilling witness to phenomena that exist outside conventional explanation. The silence of the desert can be profound, but sometimes it is what fills that silence that truly disturbs the peace. Footprints that lead nowhere, lights that move without sound, voices that speak in unknown languages. These are the mysteries that continue to occur in the shadowed canyons and moonlit mesas of the American Southwest. They remind us that our understanding of the world around us remains incomplete, that there are still phenomena that resist categorization, that continue to occur just beyond the edge of what we can explain. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Our researchers examine every account, looking for patterns and connections that might help us better understand these unexplained phenomena. The Sleepless Campfire continues to collect and document these encounters, preserving them for future generations who might have answers that we lack today. What seems impossible now may become understandable with time, perspective, and advances in our collective knowledge. The officers featured in tonight's episode continue their service to the Navajo Nation, patrolling the same remote roads where these encounters occurred. Some have transferred to different districts, seeking the comfort of more populated areas. Others remain, carrying with them the memories of what they experienced, continuing to serve and protect despite knowing that some things lie beyond their ability to control or explain. Their courage in the face of the unknown represents the best of law enforcement dedication to duty, even when confronted with phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.